My son-in-law had no idea I owned the company he works for as CEO. He always saw me living simply a quiet old man in a worn corduroy jacket who kept to himself. One evening, he invited me to a private dinner with his wealthy parents. I accepted the invitation, wanting to see exactly how they would treat a poor man. They showed their true colors the moment they slid a thick white envelope across the walnut table, offering to buy my absence from my own daughter's life. 5 minutes later, the foundation of their entire world began to collapse. Outside the city's most exclusive steakhouse, the bitter Detroit wind knifed right through my worn corduroy jacket as I stood there on the pavement. All around me, valets in sharp uniforms darted back and forth, swinging open doors on gleaming European sports cars for men whose suits alone were worth more than a solid used vehicle. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along so you never miss one. Before we go any further, drop a single word in the comments that describes how you're feeling right now. Just one word, whatever comes first. A quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. It's the truth at the heart of it that matters. I glanced down at my worn work boots, polished with care, kept clean, but unmistakably aged by years of hard use. I'd owned those boots for 15 years. One phone call, and I could have purchased the entire restaurant outright. Yet I chose to wear those boots. I chose the worn corduroy jacket. I chose to pull up in a rusted flatbed truck, which I parked 3 blocks away, rather than suffer the valet staff's smirks. I am 69 years old, and I learned long ago that real wealth is a quiet shield while showing it off, is a loud target. My name is Gerald Callahan, and my life has been shaped by 2 things: the logistics empire I built from nothing, and my daughter Nadia. Nadia was the reason I was standing out in the freezing cold that night. She had married Derek 3 years prior. From the very start, I saw Derek clearly. I noticed the calculated hunger behind his eyes, the way he sized a man up by the brand of his watch or the cut of his suit. His treatment of me was a thinly veiled contempt, a weary tolerance extended to someone he regarded as an unfortunate social burden. He was convinced I was a retired blue-collar man, scraping by on a meager state pension. He assumed my modest 2-bedroom suburban house represented the full ceiling of what my life had produced. I never set him straight. I wanted Nadia to be loved for who she was, not for the substantial trust fund sitting quietly in her name. When Derek informed me that his parents Clifford and Loretta were flying in to celebrate his recent promotion to CEO of Crestline Logistics, he included me in a dinner invitation. It was delivered with a heavy sigh, plainly an obligation rather than any genuine desire for my company. I accepted because I had to know exactly what kind of family my daughter had married into. I pushed through the restaurant's heavy brass doors. The lobby's warmth swept over me, rich with the aromas of roasted garlic, seared steak, and expensive perfume. A hostess with a rigid, practiced smile looked me over her eyes, pausing briefly on the frayed elbows of my jacket. I gave her Derek's name, and her strained smile tightened as she guided me through the bustling main dining room toward the private suites at the back. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I stepped into the private room. The hostility was there before a single word was spoken. Clifford and Loretta occupied the center of the long table, looking exactly as I'd anticipated. Clifford wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a massive gold watch catching the light on his wrist like some instrument of intimidation. Loretta was draped in a silk dress strung with pearls, her expression pulled tight with judgment. Derek sat beside them, swirling a glass of deep red wine. When I entered, not one of them rose to their feet. Clifford and Loretta swept their eyes across my clothes, their faces curdling into open, unadorned contempt. Derek didn't offer his hand. He simply aimed his wineglass toward the far end of the table, the chair positioned as remotely from them as the room allowed. Nadia wasn't there. Derek muttered that she'd slipped away to the restroom to fix her makeup. I pulled out my chair and settled into the heavy, suffocating silence. The psychological campaign opened the moment the waiter poured the water. Loretta leaned forward, her diamond-ringed fingers resting on the white tablecloth. She fixed me with a smile soaked in condescending pity, asking how my little house was holding up through the winter, pressing hard on the word little, the way you might speak about a dog kennel. She went on about the ordeal of heating their sprawling estate on Mackinac Island. Clifford cut in loudly, boasting about a recent 3-week vacation on the Amalfi Coast. He swirled his wine and let his gaze drop pointedly to my worn work boots. He asked what exactly I had done for a living before retreating to my quiet, unremarkable life. I held his gaze, keeping my voice steady and low. I told him I'd worked with my hands my whole life, spent decades managing freight-moving boxes, dealing with trucks. Every word of it, the truth. I simply left out the part where I eventually owned 10,000 of those trucks. Clifford let out a short, dismissive laugh, trading a glance with Loretta that broadcast absolute superiority. They had me filed away, instantly uneducated warehouse laborer. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face reddening with embarrassment. He looked at me as though my presence alone was a blemish on his newly acquired corporate standing. The atmosphere in that room thickened into something genuinely toxic. Every remark Loretta made, fine dining luxury cars, high society connections, was a precision-aimed insult designed to assert total dominance. I never raised my voice, never offered a defense. I sat quietly drinking my tap water, watching their arrogance with the cold, removed patience of a man who already knows how the trap springs. The waiter came back, setting down expensive cuts of meat and delicate seafood towers. Clifford ignored his food entirely. Instead, his hand went to the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He produced a thick, crisp white envelope and set it squarely on the walnut table. Then he pressed his fingertips to it and pushed it slowly across the polished surface until it came to rest directly in front of my plate. The room went deathly silent. Derek fixed his stare on his plate, unwilling to meet my eyes. Loretta lifted her wineglass with a delicate sip, watching me over the rim with a predatory smile. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at Clifford. I asked him what it was. He spoke with blunt, unapologetic brutality. He told me there was a cashier's check inside for $20,000. A relocation fund, he called it. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. I was to fabricate some story about declining health or a craving for warmer weather. I was to pack up my pathetic little house and disappear into some low-tier retirement facility in Florida or Arizona. I was to remove myself entirely from Nadia and Derek's lives. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I asked him why I would ever do such a thing. Clifford leaned in, his voice laced with venom. He stated that Derek had just been named Chief Executive Officer of Crestline Logistics. He argued that Derek now moved in circles of serious wealth and influence. He looked at my worn corduroy jacket with naked disgust. He told me my visible poverty, my lack of education, and my lower-class background were dead weight dragging on Derek's rising trajectory. A man of Derek's standing, he said, could not be seen keeping company with someone who looked like he belonged in a soup kitchen. I didn't touch the envelope. Instead, I turned my gaze slowly toward Derek, the boy I had permitted to marry my only daughter, the man who had sworn vows to honor our family. I asked Derek directly whether he agreed with his father. I asked whether he truly wanted me to pocket this money and disappear from his daughter's life. Derek finally lifted his head. He looked me straight in the eye, his expression hardened by greed and unchecked ambition, and coldly sided with his parents. He stated that his career demanded a certain image. He told me that a corporate executive running a company as large as Crestline Logistics simply cannot have a father-in-law who looks like a janitor. He told me to take the money and do what was right for everyone. The betrayal hung there in the air, vile and suffocating. Derek had handed his soul over to his own vanity without a second thought. He had no idea that the sprawling company he took such pride in running, the corporate empire that fed this disgusting sense of superiority, had been built by the very hands he was now insulting. He had no idea that the board of directors who hired him ultimately answered to a blind trust. A blind trust controlled entirely by the man sitting across from him in a frayed corduroy jacket. At that precise moment, the heavy oak door clicked open. Nadia walked back into the private dining room, her face bright and completely unaware of the execution that had just taken place. She smiled at me and asked whether they had already put in the appetizer order. Before anyone could speak, I reached out and smoothly tucked the white envelope into the inner pocket of my jacket. The atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. Clifford and Loretta traded a quick, victorious look. Derek exhaled a quiet, barely audible sigh of relief. They were certain I had surrendered. They believed the poor, pathetic old man had pocketed the bribe out of sheer desperation. I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, kind-hearted Nadia, who deserved so much better than the coward seated at that table. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table or make a public scene. Anger belongs to the powerless, and I was holding every last card. I rose slowly, keeping each movement deliberate and unhurried. I reached into my pants pocket and pulled out a single crumpled $1 bill. I smoothed it flat between my fingers and set it precisely in the center of my empty plate. I looked straight at Derek and told him the dollar was there to cover the cost of my tap water. Then I turned to Nadia, pressing a gentle smile onto my face. I told her I'd come over suddenly unwell, that the cold air had given me a headache, and I needed to get home and rest. Nadia looked genuinely alarmed, stepping toward me to wrap her arms around me. She offered to leave the dinner altogether and drive me home herself. I kissed her forehead and told her to stay and enjoy the evening with her new family. I'd call her first thing in the morning. As I pulled away from my daughter, I caught one final glimpse of Clifford. He was cutting into his expensive steak with the satisfied smirk of a man who believed he'd just purchased the world. I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the private room. I threaded through the crowded dining room, the sounds of clinking crystal and wealthy laughter receding behind me. I pushed through the brass doors and stepped out into the freezing Detroit night. The bitter wind struck my face, but I didn't feel it. The timid, unassuming old man I'd been performing for the past 2 hours dissolved away instantly. My spine straightened, my eyes sharpened against the darkness of the street. I reached into my pocket, bypassing the envelope stuffed with Clifford's filthy money, and brought out my cell phone. I scrolled to a secure number and dialed. The line rang exactly once before it was picked up. Warren, my corporate attorney, and the man who had architected my blind trust answered quietly on the other end. I skipped any greeting. I spoke with the absolute terrifying authority of a man who had just declared war. I told Warren they had taken the bait. I told him my son-in-law had stepped past the point of no return. I ordered Warren to launch an immediate, ruthless forensic audit of Derek's executive accounts at Crestline Logistics, every single dollar Derek had touched since the board put him in that chair. I stood in the shadow of the building, watching a valet deliver a silver Porsche to the restaurant's front entrance, knowing exactly how this story was going to end. The hunt was now officially underway, and I intended to tear their fraudulent little kingdom down to bare concrete. The freezing Detroit wind hammered my windshield as I drove my rusted flatbed truck into the underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. I bypassed the visitor section entirely and pulled into a secured space that had been permanently reserved under my name for 2 decades. The armed guard posted at the private executive elevator didn't ask for identification. He simply nodded with quiet respect and pressed his thumb to the biometric wall scanner. The heavy steel doors slid open and carried me up to the 48th floor. I left the helpless old man persona down in the cold streets below. By the time the elevator chimed, my posture had locked into place and my expression had hardened to stone. I was exactly who I needed to be. The doors opened onto a vast, dimly lit office with a sweeping view of the glittering city skyline. Warren stood waiting beside a long, walnut conference table. He had served as my lead corporate attorney for 30 solid years, a man whose unwavering loyalty was matched only by his ferocious effectiveness in a boardroom. He offered no pleasantries. He didn't ask how dinner with my daughter and her new in-laws had gone. He already understood why I was there. He simply pushed a stack of thick leather-bound corporate files across the polished surface toward me. I shrugged off my worn corduroy jacket, draped it over a leather chair, and sat down. I laid my hands flat on the table, feeling the full, immense weight of my life pressing up from beneath my palms. My eyes settled on the gold-embossed logo gleaming on the cover of the top file, Crestline Logistics. Derek loved throwing that corporate name around as though he'd hauled it up from the earth with his bare hands. He wielded his title as chief executive officer to intimidate waitstaff, impress his arrogant parents, and look down on me. He had absolutely no conception of what building something like this actually required. I built this company out of nothing but dirt and sheer desperation. 30 years ago, my wife Elaine passed away without warning. I was left alone in a dark world holding a grieving toddler and buried under a crushing mountain of medical debt. I scraped together my last few dollars and bought a single broken-down delivery truck at a local police auction. I worked 20 hours a day hauling heavy freight through freezing sleet and blistering summer heat. I kept little Nadia asleep on a makeshift bed in the passenger seat because I couldn't afford basic childcare. I skipped meals so she could eat. Every dollar I earned went straight back into the business. One struggling truck became a fleet of 10. 10 became 100. And eventually that desperate hustle grew into an international logistics network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Crestline Logistics was my blood and sweat, and the relentless determination to build my daughter a safe world. 10 years ago, I recognized that my heart could no longer sustain the grueling corporate pace. Our financial future was permanently secured. I chose to step away from public life to tend my small suburban garden, live quietly, and watch Nadia grow into the fiercely independent woman I always knew she'd become. I instructed Warren to draft the paperwork, placing my 70% majority ownership of Crestline Logistics into a secure, irrevocable blind trust. I named Warren as primary executor and stripped my personal name entirely from the public corporate registry. To the outside business world, the founder had simply faded into a peaceful, anonymous retirement. The executive board was left running day-to-day operations, completely unaware of the man behind the curtain. 2 years ago, that same board hired a rising corporate star named Derek to step in as chief executive officer, drawn entirely by an aggressive resume and the ability to fill a tailored suit. Derek walked into that corner office convinced he had seized the business world on the strength of his own merit alone. When he married my daughter, he looked at my worn work boots, my plain clothes, my modest suburban house, and filed me away as an uneducated failure. He had no idea whatsoever that the corporation bankrolling his luxury cars, his tailored suits, and his insufferable pride belonged entirely to the quiet old man he was now trying to erase. He imagined himself the undisputed king of the castle. He was a hired hand working blind inside a fortress I built with my own 2 hands. I looked up at Warren, who stood silently across the table waiting for his instructions. I reached into my shirt pocket and produced the crisp white envelope holding the $20,000 bribe Derek and his parents had pressed on me barely an hour earlier. I tossed it onto the center of the table. I told Warren that my son-in-law had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. He had mistaken my deliberate silence for weakness and my simple life for total defeat. He wanted to purchase my absence to safeguard his precious corporate image. I told Warren it was time to show Derek exactly who owned and controlled that image. I leaned forward and gave the order. I instructed Warren to lift the veil of the blind trust immediately by every legal means available. I wanted my name reinstated on the private executive registry. I demanded full unrestricted access at the highest level of corporate clearance. Warren gave a sharp, cold nod, a thin smile forming at the edge of his mouth. He opened his secure laptop and entered a rapid sequence of commands that instantly deactivated the decade-long anonymity shield protecting my controlling shares. The system chimed softly confirming that Gerald Callahan was officially back in absolute command of the board. The sleeping giant had been rudely awakened by a fool who thought he was throwing stones at a ghost. The wall separating my personal life from my business empire was gone, but reclaiming my identity was only the opening move. I wasn't simply going to fire Derek. I needed to know precisely what he had been doing behind my desk. I ordered Warren to have the accounting team ready. We were going to open the books. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn corduroy jacket and drew out the crisp white envelope. I dropped it onto the polished walnut table in front of Warren. The soft thud of the paper seemed to hang in the stillness of the office. I told Warren to open it. He reached out with practiced hands and slid the cashier's check from the unsealed flap. He studied the $20,000 figure, then raised his eyes to mine with a silent question. I told him that was the precise value my son-in-law had assigned to my dignity. That was the sum Derek and his arrogant parents considered sufficient to ship me off to some low-tier retirement facility and scrub me clean from my daughter's life. They wanted me to pocket their money and vanish so I wouldn't soil their spotless corporate image. Warren set the check down. His face hardened into a cold mask of professional fury. He knew every sacrifice I'd made to build Crestline Logistics. He knew I had gone without meals and slept in a freezing delivery truck so Nadia could have a warm, safe bed. I leaned across the table and handed Warren his next directive. I told him I didn't just want to fire Derek. I wanted to dismantle his entire existence piece by piece. I ordered a complete, merciless forensic audit of every executive account Derek had touched since the board installed him as chief executive officer. The nature of this conflict shifted immediately. This was no longer a personal insult traded over expensive steaks and cheap wine. This was outright corporate warfare. Warren didn't waste a single breath. Within an hour, he had converted the private boardroom into a sealed command center. He assembled a team of elite forensic accountants, men and women, whose specialty was tearing fraudulent financial empires apart at the seams. They were the finest in Detroit, completely independent of Crestline Logistics' internal finance department. I sat at the head of the table, nursing bitter black coffee, as I watched them bring their encrypted servers online. I handed them Derek's executive authorization codes, the very codes I had quietly granted him, through the blind trust. I instructed the team to hunt down every concealed transaction, every unauthorized bonus, and every shadowed expense report. I wanted them to crack open the foundation of Derek's luxurious lifestyle and expose whatever rot was festering underneath. The accountants worked in complete silence. The only sound in the room was the relentless rapid clicking of keyboards. I watched the digital files spread across the massive wall monitor. Years of corporate data began flowing like a river of numbers. For 48 hours, I barely left that leather chair. I sat and watched the team dissect the company I had built with my bare hands. My mind drifted back to the early days of Crestline Logistics, manually balancing ledgers at my kitchen table late at night, making certain every driver was paid, fairly ensuring every vendor received their checks on time. I had built my reputation on an unshakable foundation of honesty. My word was as binding as any contract. I never took a single cent that wasn't mine. Seeing Derek's name printed across the top of those executive accounts filled me with a sickening sense of violation. He was sitting in my chair using my company to fuel his vanity. As the second night closed in, the lead accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Petra, stopped typing. She glanced at Warren, then rotated her monitor to face me. She told me they had found a discrepancy, not a simple accounting error or a misplaced corporate expense, a massive deliberate bleed. Petra pulled up a complex web of financial transfers on the main screen. She explained that for the past 18 months, Derek had been systematically bypassing the board of directors' oversight committee. He was an arrogant snob, yes, but the audit had uncovered something far more dangerous. Derek was a highly calculated criminal. He had constructed a network of dummy shell companies registered under fabricated vendor names. He was signing off on enormous logistical contracts for services that were never performed. Millions of dollars of Crestline Logistics capital were being siphoned straight out of the corporate treasury and funneled into these phantom accounts. I stared at the figures glowing on the screen. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. He was actively bleeding my life's work dry to finance his own private kingdom. The man who had looked at me with utter contempt, who had called me a pathetic burden, was nothing more than a parasitic thief feeding off my legacy. Every transaction told the same story of unchecked, unbridled greed. The accountants traced the shell companies back to private offshore accounts controlled exclusively by Derek. He had dismantled every security measure I had put in place when I stepped away a decade ago. He used his position to forge approval signatures from unsuspecting department heads. He manipulated quarterly profit reports to conceal the gaping holes in the company treasury. The board of directors had trusted him completely because he delivered polished, fabricated presentations. He sold them a story of relentless corporate growth, while he was quietly butchering the company from the inside out. A cold, unforgiving rage tightened in my chest. He was stealing the future I had secured for Nadia. He was stealing the livelihoods of thousands of honest employees who depended on Crestline Logistics to put food on their families' tables. I looked at Warren. The evidence was ironclad. We had the digital footprints, the forged invoices, and the offshore routing numbers. Derek was committing severe federal fraud. The penalty for this level of corporate embezzlement was decades inside a maximum security federal prison. Warren asked whether I wanted him to contact the authorities immediately. He said we could have Derek arrested at his desk by morning. I shook my head slowly. An immediate arrest was too quiet, too clean. Derek and his arrogant parents had humiliated me in public. They had tried to purchase my dignity and erase me from my daughter's life with a $20,000 check. They had believed themselves to be untouchable masters of the universe. I refused to let them disappear behind a quiet corporate scandal. I wanted Derek to feel the exact same public humiliation he had tried to force on me. I told Warren to prepare a comprehensive dossier accounting for every single stolen dollar. I told him to lock the evidence down and prepare for a total corporate execution. But the threat was escalating fast. Petra cut into my thoughts. She had pulled up an internal corporate memo Derek had just distributed to the board of directors. He was planning something massive and aggressive maneuver that would let him steal what remained of the company right out from under the blind trust. The war had just shifted into a higher gear, and time was running short. Petra's fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the complex digital roots of the stolen millions. The offshore accounts we'd uncovered were not the final destination. They were a transit hub, a smokescreen engineered to obscure the true movement of the capital. She brought up a fresh set of encrypted banking records and put them on the main conference room monitor. I pushed back from my leather chair and walked toward the glowing screen. The conflict instantly transformed from a sterile corporate crime into something deeply personal. Derek wasn't parking the money in the Cayman Islands for some future escape. He was actively routing it back into the United States through a tangled web of supposed consulting fees, fabricated marketing retainers, and anonymous family trusts. The primary beneficiaries of these fraudulent trusts were Clifford and Loretta. I stood there staring at the financial statements lighting up the darkened room. The pieces of the puzzle crashed together with sickening, undeniable clarity. The opulent lifestyle Clifford had dangled in my face just hours ago was not the product of shrewd investments or a lifetime of honest work. Their entire high society existence was a carefully constructed mirage funded entirely by capital drained straight from my company's treasury. Petra pulled up the itemized expenditure reports tied to the family trust. I saw the receipts for the 3-week vacation on the Amalfi Coast that Clifford had loudly boasted about over his expensive steak. I saw the substantial invoices for the custom charcoal suits, the designer luggage, and the diamond jewelry Loretta wore like a royal crown. I saw the transfer logs for 2 imported luxury vehicles registered in Clifford's name, paid in full with cash, diverted from a Crestline Logistics shipping contract. Then, Petra opened the largest transaction file in the entire forensic audit. Just 2 weeks ago, Derek had wired $4 million from a Crestline Logistics Emergency Reserve Fund directly into Loretta's private holding company. That money was immediately used to purchase a newly commissioned 80-FD yacht moored at a premier marina in Miami. My breathing slowed as the breathtaking audacity of the crime settled over me. I thought back to that crisp white envelope sliding across the walnut table at the restaurant. They had looked me in the eye and offered me a $20,000 bribe to pack up my life and disappear from my daughter's world. They had told me I was a social anchor, dragging their pristine image down. The crushing irony was that the very money they had used to insult my dignity had been stolen from the treasury I built with my own bare hands. They had tried to purchase my absence using my own life's savings. A hot, violent surge of pure rage threatened to shatter my carefully maintained composure. I thought back to the grueling early years of building Crestline Logistics, sitting with my first dozen drivers in a freezing warehouse, promising them fair wages and establishing a pension fund from our very first profits, so their families would never know the hollowing hunger I had lived through. I treated that corporate treasury with absolute reverence because it represented the survival and security of thousands of honest, hard-working people. Derek was using that sacred treasury as a personal piggy bank to buy yachts for 2 arrogant parasites who had never broken a sweat in their comfortable lives. I closed my eyes and forced the heat of that anger back down into my chest. Rage makes a man careless, and I couldn't afford a single tactical mistake. I let it cool and compress into a cold, dense, unbreakable block of calculated ice. Firing my son-in-law no longer felt like nearly enough. Firing him would be an act of mercy. A quiet arrest would give his parents the chance to conceal the stolen assets, declare bankruptcy, and play the grieving victims of a rogue son. I wanted to dismantle their entire reality from the ground up. I wanted Clifford and Loretta to feel the same poverty, the same helplessness, and the same public humiliation they had tried to press down on me. I turned back to Warren. The brilliant attorney stood quietly reading the cold resolve settling across my face. I told him we were no longer preparing a standard executive termination package. We were invoking federal racketeering statutes. I ordered Warren to trace every physical asset Clifford and Loretta had acquired over the past 18 months. Every car, every piece of jewelry, every vacation property, and that massive yacht, I wanted all of it legally bound to the criminal embezzlement case. When the federal authorities finally moved, I wanted the net to fall over the entire family at once. Clifford and Loretta were not innocent bystanders who had stumbled blindly into their son's sudden wealth. The financial trail proved they were active accomplices knowingly receiving stolen corporate capital channeled through fraudulent consulting firms, registered in their own names. Warren gave a sharp nod, a predatory gleam lighting his eyes. He immediately began pulling the necessary legal mandates to freeze civilian assets connected to corporate fraud. I told him to prepare the guillotine with surgical precision. We were not going to strike tonight. We were going to let Derek proceed with his grand corporate merger gala this weekend. We were going to let him stand on a brightly lit stage before the city's elite, believing he had successfully pushed the pathetic old father-in-law out of the frame. We were going to let Clifford and Loretta wear their stolen diamonds, raise their expensive champagne flutes, and bask in the admiration of their counterfeit high society circle. I wanted them to reach the absolute summit of their manufactured arrogance. The higher they climbed on that pedestal of lies, the more devastating the drop would be. Petra handed me a printed summary of the stolen funds and the linked family accounts. I folded the heavy sheet and placed it in the inner pocket of my shirt, right alongside the $20,000 cashier's check Clifford had handed me at the restaurant. The two pieces of paper rested against my chest, representing the complete arc of their coming destruction. I thanked the accounting team for their relentless and brilliant work. I told them to lock the files, encrypt the servers completely, and not breathe a word to anyone until I gave the signal. I lifted my worn corduroy jacket from the back of the leather chair and walked toward the private executive elevator. The sun was just beginning to break over the Detroit skyline, casting a cold, hard light across the sleeping city. Derek truly believed he had outwitted a foolish, uneducated old man. He was convinced his power was absolute. He was about to discover exactly what happens when you try to rob the man who designed the fortress you're standing in. I stepped into the elevator, my mind already mapping the precise sequence of events for the gala. The trap was set, the evidence was locked, and the execution was inevitable. The heavy thud of a luxury car door slamming on my quiet suburban street pulled me up from what I was doing. I was kneeling in the front yard, pressing fresh earth around a row of newly planted azaleas. My hands were dark with soil, a physical connection to the hard grounding work that had always anchored my life. I heard the sharp, impatient click of expensive leather shoes, advancing up my concrete driveway. I didn't need to raise my eyes to know who had shown up unannounced. Derek cast a long shadow over my garden. He stood there in a tailored silver suit, eyeing my modest single-story home as though it were a contagious disease. No polite greeting, no inquiry about my day. He simply demanded we go inside immediately because the neighborhood was offending him. I rose slowly, wiped the dirt from my hands onto an old rag, and led him into the house I had purchased 30 years ago to raise his wife. Derek entered my living room, wearing an expression of profound contempt, deliberately refusing to wipe his expensive shoes on the welcome mat. His eyes swept the faded floral sofa, the worn brick fireplace, the framed photographs of Nadia's childhood arranged along the mantel. He scoffed openly, clearly reading my entire existence as a monument to failure. He dropped a thick leather briefcase onto my small wooden coffee table and snapped the gold clasps open with aggressive force. He yanked out a stack of densely typed legal documents and threw them down in front of me. He told me to sit down and read. I stayed on my feet. I looked at the papers, then at the man who believed a fabricated corporate title entitled him to conduct himself like a king inside my home. Derek announced that the $20,000 check his father had offered me at the restaurant was merely the opening of our arrangement. He had decided to formalize my total removal from his life. He jabbed a manicured finger at the printed pages, tapping the heavy cardstock to underscore his authority. He explained that the document was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement combined with a complete renunciation of rights. I was to legally swear I would never speak of the financial bribe his parents had tendered, and I would officially renounce any future claim to Nadia's financial support. He wanted me legally bound to absolute poverty and permanent silence. I asked him what would happen if I refused to sign his insulting paperwork. Derek stepped in closer, crowding my personal space, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. He threatened to sever my relationship with my daughter entirely. He claimed he controlled their joint finances, their living situation, and her whole future. He promised to make my life a misery, ensuring I would never lay eyes on Nadia or any future grandchildren if I dared defy him. He spoke of my daughter not as a woman he loved, but as an asset he had acquired. He was using my own flesh and blood as a bargaining chip to protect his fragile vanity. He was holding my family hostage to shore up his fraudulent corporate image. I looked down at the legal contract on my coffee table. I read the clauses outlining my supposed financial irrelevance and enforced isolation. A younger version of me, the man who had raised a freight empire from blistered hands and raw fury, might well have broken Derek's jaw on the spot. I had crushed far more ruthless corporate adversaries for far less. But decades had taught me the lethal power of patience exercised at the right moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show him a single trace of anger or sorrow. I walked into the kitchen, scrubbed the garden soil from my hands, and dried them carefully and slowly. I came back to the living room, picked up a cheap plastic pen from the counter, and leaned over the coffee table. I signed my name at the very bottom of his extortion document. I put my signature down with a slow, deliberate, and chillingly calm smile. Derek snatched the papers off the table the instant my pen left the page. He drove them back into his briefcase, his chest swelling with overwhelming pride. He had walked into my home and bullied an old man into submission. He felt like an untouchable master of the universe. His arrogance blinded him completely to what had actually just taken place. He had handed me written signed proof of his attempt to extort the majority shareholder of his own company. He had documented his own blackmail. Derek snapped his briefcase shut and moved toward the front door, his whole bearing telegraphing a victory he hadn't earned. Before stepping back into the daylight, he turned to deliver one last calculated barb. He told me he was throwing a massive corporate merger gala for Crestline Logistics that, coming weekend, the crowning achievement of his career, he said a night of extravagant luxury that would lock in his legacy as the most powerful CEO in the city. And he made it perfectly clear that I was not to come anywhere near the venue. My presence, he informed me, would be a grotesque embarrassment to his distinguished guests. Hotel security would haul me out to the curb if I dared show my face and disgrace him in front of the board. I stood in the middle of my quiet, modest living room. I looked at this man, the one who had looted millions from my company's treasury to bankroll his parents' yacht, the one who was at that very moment grinding my only child down, and I kept my voice smooth, perfectly empty of fear or anger. I told Derek I understood his position entirely. I wished him a fine evening at his grand affair. He sneered, muttered something contemptuous under his breath, and walked out. Through the front window, I watched his luxury car disappear down the street. He was certain he had cut me out of the board for good. He had no idea I was already rewriting every rule of the game. The documents were signed, the trap was laid, and the weekend was nearly here. The man who thought he'd buried me was about to find out he'd only dug his own grave. The sun had barely gone down when the rain started hammering the roof of my little suburban home. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the extortion contract Derek had forced me to sign just hours before. I was working through the precise sequence of legal moves Warren would set in motion Monday morning. The house was completely silent. Then a frantic, rapid knocking broke against my front door. Not the bold, arrogant pounding of my son-in-law. Something far more desperate, a panicked, urgent rhythm. I walked down the hall and pulled the door open. My daughter Nadia stood on the porch, soaked to the bone in the freezing downpour. She had a thin coat over her clothes, drenched through her hair, stuck flat against her face. The bright, fiercely independent woman I'd raised looked utterly shattered. She didn't say anything. She just folded into my chest, pressing her face into my shoulder, as a deep, wrenching sob tore through her. I drew her inside at once and locked the door against the cold night. I steered her into the kitchen, draped a thick wool blanket over her trembling shoulders, and put the kettle on. I didn't ask what happened. I already knew who had done this to her. I pulled a chair up across from her and let her find her breath. Nadia wrapped both shaking hands around the warm ceramic mug. Her eyes dropped to the worn surface of my old kitchen table. She told me she'd gone to the grocery store that afternoon. When she went to pay for a simple basket of food, her card was declined. She tried a second card, then a third. Every account carrying her name had been locked solid. When she called Derek to ask if something had gone wrong at the bank, he didn't show a moment's concern. He went off like a shot, accusing her of being financially reckless, a liability to his corporate standing. He told her he'd frozen the accounts to teach her some basic discipline. My hands balled into fists beneath the table. Derek was methodically isolating her. Cutting off her money was about stripping her independence, forcing her into total submission. But financial isolation was only his opening move. Nadia steadied herself with a shaky breath and told me the real reason she had fled into the storm. Derek had come home from work about an hour later, carrying a stack of legal documents. He'd slammed them down on the kitchen island and told her to sign them on the spot. They were a full transfer of assets. He wanted her to hand over the private inheritance fund her mother had set aside for her. Before I built the logistics empire, before the blind trusts and the offshore accounts, my late wife Elaine had received a small life insurance payout from her own parents. Elaine had designated that money specifically for Nadia, a modest, untouchable safety net meant to protect our daughter if the world ever turned against her. Derek knew that money existed. He told Nadia he needed the inheritance capital to secure a bridge loan for a large new estate they were supposedly purchasing on Mackinac Island. He framed it as a temporary transfer, a routine formality the bank required to process the mortgage. When Nadia hesitated and asked to read the paperwork first, Derek turned terrifyingly cruel. He called her an ungrateful burden. He told her she was insulting his judgment as a chief executive, and he informed her that if she hadn't signed the inheritance over to him by the following morning, the marriage was done. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my heartbroken daughter, as the final piece of Derek's grand design clicked into place with horrible clarity. Derek wasn't buying a house on Mackinac Island. He was running a total extraction. Warren's forensic audit had already established that Derek had been bleeding my company dry to finance his parents' fraudulent lifestyle and his own secret offshore accounts. Now, the timeline was unmistakable. Derek knew that the merger gala would produce a massive surge of temporary capital. He intended to exploit the chaos of the merger to drain the last remaining millions from the Crestline Logistics treasury. Once the merger was complete and those funds were hidden inside his untraceable shell companies, he would disappear. He'd take the company millions, take the yacht he'd bought for Clifford and Loretta, and walk away from his life in Detroit entirely. But his greed was so total, so all-consuming, that he couldn't leave a single dollar on the table. He wanted Elaine's money too. He meant to strip our daughter of her last lifeline, drain her late mother's inheritance into his offshore accounts, and file for divorce the moment his plane touched down somewhere without an extradition treaty. He was going to throw Nadia away like she was nothing, leaving her penniless, humiliated, and shattered. A cold, lethal stillness settled through my whole body. I looked at the tears running down my daughter's face. Every instinct I had as her father screamed at me to lay it all out right there at that table. I wanted to tell her that I owned the very building Derek worked in. I wanted her to know I held his entire miserable existence in the palm of my hand. I wanted to tell her she was heir to an empire worth hundreds of millions, and that Derek was nothing but a dead man who hadn't received the news yet. But I held it all back. Nadia didn't need a corporate titan in that moment. She needed her father. She needed the quiet, steady presence that had always made her feel safe. And beyond that, I needed Derek to feel completely, totally untouchable for just 48 more hours. If I revealed who I was to Nadia now, any change in her manner might tip Derek off that the trap had closed. I needed him to stride onto that stage at the corporate gala, believing he was the undisputed master of everything. I reached across the table and folded Nadia's trembling hands inside mine. I met her eyes directly, her gaze still wet with tears. And I told her in a voice that carried no room for argument or doubt that she was not going back to that house. I told her she would sleep in her old childhood bedroom tonight, and she would not return a single call or message from her husband. The bank accounts she should leave alone, and her mother's inheritance she would not sign over to anyone. Nadia looked up at me, her voice shaking as she asked what we were going to do. She was frightened of Derek's power, terrified of the massive corporate shadow he threw over their lives. She believed every card in the deck was his. I reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with my thumb. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had already won. I promised her that before the weekend was out, Derek would never be able to hurt her or anyone else ever again. I promised her the nightmare was already finished. She eased back into her chair, closed her eyes, and let out a long, slow breath, as though she was releasing something she'd been holding for a very long time. She trusted me completely. She didn't ask how a retired laborer planned to bring down a powerful chief executive. She simply knew her father had made a promise. I got up, cleared the teacups away, and walked her to her old room. I stayed until I heard the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing as she finally drifted off. I went back to the kitchen and picked up my cell phone. The pain I had just seen in my daughter's eyes wiped out whatever thin trace of mercy I might still have carried for Derek or his arrogant parents. This wasn't just a corporate cleanup anymore. This was a profound, absolute reckoning. I dialed Warren's secure line and told him to move the timeline up. The trap was going to slam shut at the gala, and it would be the most spectacular takedown this city had ever witnessed. I left my daughter sleeping safely in her childhood bed and drove into the heart of the financial district before the sun had even cleared the Detroit skyline. The city was still draped in a cold pre-dawn gray. I walked into Warren's office. He was already there, waiting immaculately put together, a fresh pot of coffee steaming on his glass desk. There was no time for small talk. We both understood the clock had sped up. I settled into the heavy leather chair across from him and told him it was time to bring it all down. I instructed Warren to invoke the full legal force of my majority shares. I called for an immediate total executive freeze across the entire corporate structure of Crestline Logistics. Through my emergency shareholder privileges, I held the unilateral authority to lock the company's financial arteries solid. Warren drafted the mandate with ruthless efficiency. The document suspended all board-level transactional authority. It froze every executive account. It stopped all outbound corporate wire transfers and brought the Treasury to a complete standstill. I picked up a heavy black pen and signed my name at the bottom of the page. With that single signature, Derek was cut off from the company vault entirely. He just didn't know it yet. The reaction inside the Crestline Logistics executive suite was instantaneous and gloriously chaotic. Warren monitored the internal corporate communications from his encrypted terminal. By 9:00 in the morning, the board of directors was in a state of full panic. For a decade, they had operated under the comfortable illusion that the anonymous founder was a silent hands-off presence content to collect his annual dividends and stay out of the way. Now the ghost had woken up, slammed his fist on the table, and locked the vault. Emails tore back and forth across secure servers in a frantic frenzy. Vice presidents were beside themselves with fear. Nobody could understand why the founder had triggered a hard freeze. They scrambled to audit their own departments, terrified they were the ones in the crosshairs of this sudden corporate wrath. I didn't let them breathe. I ordered Warren to issue a second directive to the board, far more unsettling than the first. As controlling shareholder, I formally demanded a mandatory disclosure meeting, but I didn't schedule it for some ordinary Tuesday morning in a sterile conference room. I set it for Saturday night, right in the middle of the grand corporate merger gala Derek had so carefully orchestrated to celebrate his own manufactured brilliance. I instructed the legal department to compel the attendance of the full executive board, chief executive officer included. Derek would be forced to host the very gathering that would destroy him. Warren drafted the corporate summons with flawless precision. He made certain my personal identity stayed strictly sealed behind the ironclad protections of the blind trust. To Derek and the board, the summons appeared simply as a directive from the founder. It stated that the majority shareholder would step out of anonymity to personally address the executive team regarding the company's future. It was an offer the board had no power to decline, and a command Derek had no legal standing to ignore. He was bound by law to provide the stage for his own undoing, but the corporate maneuvers were only half the battle. Removing Derek from his post was a straightforward business decision. Putting him in a federal penitentiary was a moral obligation. I watched Warren lift his secure landline and bypass local law enforcement entirely. He contacted the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. Warren had spent the previous 48 hours assembling the forensic audit into a bulletproof federal dossier. He spoke quietly and precisely into the receiver, laying out the full devastation of Derek's crimes. He walked through the dummy shell companies. He itemized the forged vendor invoices. He provided the exact routing numbers tracing millions of dollars systematically drained to purchase luxury yachts and European vacations for Clifford and Loretta. The federal agents didn't need any persuading. The paper trail we delivered was airtight and beyond dispute. It drew a vivid picture of a greedy executive raiding a multinational corporation like his own private bank account. Warren coordinated the exact timing of the operation. The federal authorities agreed to station a tactical white-collar crime unit in the service corridors of the hotel during the gala, completely out of sight. They would hold their position until the trap was sprung. The moment I laid the evidence bare on that stage, they would move. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of Warren's office looking down over the churning financial district. Below me, thousands of people were streaming to their jobs, completely unaware of the invisible earthquake shaking through the foundations of Crestline Logistics. Derek was up in his massive corner office right now, probably admiring his own reflection in the glass, utterly blind to the fact that his corporate credit cards had become worthless plastic. He He believed he was a genius running the perfect crime. He thought he could plunder my company, crush my daughter, and throw $20,000 in my face to seal his flawless victory. He felt untouchable because he wore a designer suit and held a fabricated title. He had no idea that real power doesn't live in a title or a tailored jacket. Real power is the ability to dismantle a man's entire world without ever raising your voice. The legal trap was locked, loaded, and primed to fire. Every exit had been methodically sealed off. The federal agents were briefed, the board was terrified, and the stolen money was frozen. All that remained was to wait for Saturday night. The smell of cedar sawdust and motor oil has always given me a deep, settled sense of peace. It was late Wednesday afternoon, and I was standing in the middle of aisle 4 at Garner & Sons Hardware. I had on my faded denim work jeans, worn work boots, and a thick canvas shirt that had seen better decades. I was loading 40 lb bags of garden mulch onto a heavy metal flatbed cart. My hands were calloused and dark with earth. I've always held that a man needs to keep his hands in the dirt to stay honest about where he came from. Building Crestline Logistics into a multinational powerhouse had meant custom-tailored suits and sterile glass boardrooms for years on end, but I never lost sight of the raw, honest labor that had laid the foundation of everything I was. I hauled the 6th heavy bag onto the cart, feeling the familiar, satisfying burn in my shoulders. I pushed the squeaking cart toward the front registers, settling into the quiet rhythm of a simple afternoon. The local hardware store was my sanctuary, a place where people measured a man by his work, not his title or his Polish. I was at the checkout counter, drawing my worn leather wallet from my pocket, when a shrill, wildly out-of-place voice shattered the calm of the store. I turned my head slowly. Clifford and Loretta were standing just inside the automatic sliding doors. They looked absolutely absurd in that setting. Clifford had a pristine, cream-colored cashmere sweater draped across his shoulders and spotless white loafers that had plainly never made contact with a single speck of real dirt. Loretta was wrapped in a tailored silk trench coat, gripping a designer handbag that cost more than the cashier standing in front of me earned in 6 months. They were completely out of their element, most likely hunting for some upscale garden boutique in the next suburb over, and had wandered in here by mistake. Clifford spotted me almost immediately. His eyes traveled over my dirty work boots, my worn canvas shirt, and the heavy bags of mulch stacked on my cart. A cruel, predatory smile spread across his face. He nudged his wife and aimed a manicured finger directly at me. Clifford strode over to my checkout lane, pulling Loretta along by her expensive silk sleeve. He made no effort to lower his voice or show any regard for the quiet of the store. He wanted the cashier, an older gentleman named Rupert, whom I had known for 15 years, to catch every single word. Clifford looked at the heavy bags of dirt and let out a loud theatrical laugh that bounced off the high warehouse ceiling. He told me it was entirely fitting to find me dressed like a vagrant hauling dirt. Said it was precisely the kind of low, pitiful existence I was destined for, now that his brilliant son was permanently in charge of my company. I stood perfectly still. No fists, no raised voice, no angry rebuttal. I simply held Clifford's gaze and looked straight into his arrogant eyes. I thought about the massive 80ft yacht sitting in Miami, the one purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds that he was currently enjoying. He was a parasite, mocking the very host keeping him alive. Loretta stepped forward, her heavy, expensive perfume rolling off her in a nauseating wave that smothered every honest smell in the store. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unvarnished contempt. She announced loudly that it was a genuine blessing I had finally found my proper place in the world. She boasted that Derek was going to completely remake Crestline Logistics this weekend and scrub away every last trace of my outdated blue-collar influence. She practically trembled with malicious pleasure as she described the upcoming merger gala. She told the whole front of the store that her son was on the verge of becoming the most powerful chief executive in the state. She went on about the imported champagne, the celebrity guest list they had assembled, and the glittering future her family was stepping into. She looked down at my work boots and informed me that people of my station belong exactly where I was standing, coated in dirt, entirely forgotten by polite society. She told me to enjoy playing in the mud while the real architects of power built something that would last. Clifford laughed smoothly, adjusting his cashmere sweater, adding that they'd be sure to raise a glass to my miserable retirement out on their new boat. I absorbed every word without breaking eye contact for even a moment. I gave them nothing, no reaction, no defense of my legacy, no acknowledgement of my clothes. I simply let them talk. I let them bury themselves with their own careless, arrogant words. They believed they were humiliating a beaten old man in front of an audience. They had no idea they were standing face to face with the man who had already engineered their destruction. Every vicious word out of Loretta's mouth brought back the image of my daughter, Nadia's face streaked with tears the night before. Nadia had stood trembling in my kitchen, her cards frozen solid and her inheritance under threat from the very family now sneering at me across a checkout lane. That memory settled into a cold, lethal calm at the center of my chest. Their arrogance had blinded them completely. The federal agents were briefed, the corporate trap was fully armed, and the legal documents bore my signature. Every insult they threw at me in that hardware store only hammered another nail into their own coffins. I turned back to Rupert, the cashier who was watching Clifford and Loretta, with quiet professional disdain. I laid 3 crisp $100 bills on the counter for the garden mulch. In a warm, steady voice, I told him to keep the rest and get his grandchildren something nice for the weekend. Rupert nodded with quiet respect, paying no attention whatsoever to the 2 loud, obnoxious figures behind me. He passed me my receipt and wished me a good day. I gripped the handle of the flatbed cart and pushed it right past Clifford and Loretta. Not a word, not a glance. I walked steadily through the sliding glass doors and out into the bright afternoon. I loaded the bags into the back of my old rusted flatbed truck, feeling the familiar weight of the earth in my hands. The storm was arriving Saturday night, and I was entirely ready to watch it sweep them all away. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its heavy brass pendulum keeping its relentless, indifferent beat. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, surrounded by the deep quiet of a sleeping suburban neighborhood. A single overhead lamp cast a hard white light across the dense stacks of legal documents spread out in front of me. Tomorrow night was the grand corporate merger gala. Tomorrow night, Derek expected to cement his place as an untouchable corporate titan. I turned another page of the forensic audit, slowly tracing columns of stolen millions with the tip of my pen. There was a profound, almost eerie stillness inside my chest. The anger that had blazed so fiercely all week had burned completely through. What was left was cold and sharp and far more dangerous. It was the quiet certainty of a man who had already measured the exact dimensions of his enemy's grave. My cell phone buzzed against the table, a sharp vibration cutting through the silence. It was Warren. I picked up on the first ring, keeping my voice low so as not to wake Nadia. He didn't waste a breath on small talk. He told me the federal snare was officially armed. The lead investigator at the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had personally reviewed our final dossier, the forged invoices, the offshore routing numbers, the dummy shell companies. The evidence was absolutely irrefutable. Warren confirmed that a tactical unit of federal agents would arrive at the hotel the following evening in unmarked vehicles. They'd take up positions in the service corridors, the underground parking garage, and the private security rooms long before the first guest walked through the door. They would wait in complete silence, invisible to the arrogant socialites sipping champagne in the ballroom. The authorities needed only one thing: my signal. The moment I laid the evidence out on that stage and exposed the fraud publicly, they would move in and lock down the entire venue. No one would be leaving. The corporate guillotine wasn't just raised, it was oiled, sharpened, and waiting for the blade to drop. I thanked Warren for his flawless work and ended the call. I gathered the audit summaries, the bank transfer records, and the photographic evidence of Clifford and Loretta's luxury purchases. I squared the edges of the thick sheaf of papers and set them inside a heavy, dark leather portfolio. I ran my palm over the smooth grain of the leather. This was not simply a collection of corporate records. It was a lethal weapon forged in the fires of their own bottomless greed. It held absolute proof of Derek's parasitic theft and Clifford's eager, knowing complicity. It was the precise financial machinery they had used to bankroll their lavish, fraudulent, high society lifestyle, and it was the very instrument that would now drag them into public ruin. I snapped the brass clasp shut. The metallic click landed like a prison cell door locking into place. There was no room left for mercy. Mercy belongs to those who make mistakes. Derek and his parents had not made a mistake. They had made a cold, calculated, predatory choice to tear my family apart for the sake of their own vanity. I left the portfolio on the table and walked down the quiet hall to my bedroom. I opened the deep cedar closet and reached to the very back. I pulled out a heavy garment bag that hadn't seen the light of day in exactly 10 years. I unzipped the canvas and carefully revealed a bespoke charcoal gray suit, tailored from the finest Scottish wool. I had commissioned that suit for the evening I officially retired and handed Crestline Logistics over to the board of directors. It was the armor of the founder. For a decade I had been content in faded denim and worn work boots, letting the corporate world forget the man who had built their empire up from nothing. I had settled into the quiet life, genuinely believing my fighting days were behind me, but Derek and Clifford had demanded a war. They had forced the very architect of their fortress to come back to the battlefield. I carried the suit to the ironing board in the corner of the room. I plugged in the iron and watched the steam begin to curl into the cool air. I laid the charcoal trousers across the board and started pressing the fabric in long, deliberate strokes. The rhythmic hiss of the steam and the smooth drag of the hot iron steadied me. It was a simple, repetitive task, but it felt deeply ceremonial. With every pass, I smoothed away the humble, invisible old man they had mocked so openly in that hardware store. I was pressing clean, unforgiving creases into the fabric, preparing the uniform of a corporate executioner. I thought about Nadia sleeping in her childhood bed, just down the hall, her heart broken by a man who had treated her as nothing more than a temporary financial asset. I thought about the sheer arrogance of Derek walking into my living room and demanding I sign away my dignity and my daughter's inheritance. What's coming next is the moment everything Gerald had quietly carried for years finally had a place to land, and the people who thought they were untouchable are about to find out exactly how wrong they were. Before we get there, tell me this. If someone you loved was being used as a pawn against you, would you act fast and loud, or would you wait and let the evidence do the talking? I thought about Clifford laughing at my dirty hands while wearing clothes bought with my stolen money. Every one of those memories fed the cold machinery of my resolve. They believed they were masters of the universe, perched at the very summit of a glittering mountain. They had no idea that the mountain beneath their feet was a volcano, and I was holding the detonator. I hung the perfectly pressed suit on a heavy wooden valet stand beside the window. The rich, dark fabric seemed to pull the light from the room, radiating a quiet, commanding authority. Beside it, I laid a crisp white dress shirt and a silver silk tie. I polished a pair of black Derby shoes until they gleamed like dark mirrors, erasing every last trace of the garden dirt Clifford had found so deeply amusing. The physical transformation was nearly done. Tomorrow evening, the pitiful low-class father-in-law they despised so thoroughly would disappear forever. In his place, the absolute majority shareholder of Crestline Logistics would push through the gilded doors of their exclusive gala. I walked back into the kitchen and switched off the overhead lamp, dropping the room into darkness. The leather portfolio sat on the table, a dark shape against the polished wood. The collision course was irrevocably set. Physics and consequence were now fully in command. Derek had built his entire kingdom on a foundation of lies, theft, and contempt. Tomorrow night, the weight of his own actions would come crashing down on his head. He wanted a grand spectacle to cement his legacy in front of the city's elite. I was going to give him exactly that. I was going to give him an audience. I stood in the quiet shadows of my home, looking out at the empty street. There was not a trace of fear or hesitation anywhere inside me. I was completely ready. The long game of patience and silence was officially finished. Tomorrow, the world would hear the sound of the falling blade. The grand ballroom of the city hotel was a cathedral of glass and gold. An enormous crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, scattering warm, fractured light over a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air carried the heavy scent of expensive orchids and imported champagne. A jazz trio played soft standards from a raised platform in the corner, laying down the perfect soundtrack for an illusion of total success. This was the summit of high society, a carefully assembled collection of politicians, bank executives, and industry leaders. To an uninformed eye, it looked like a celebration of corporate triumph. To me, it was a crime scene. Every shimmering light, every velvet drape, and every silver platter of caviar had been financed with the lifeblood of Crestline Logistics. About an hour earlier, I had stood in the quiet of my modest living room, reviewing the final legal documents one last time. Warren had called on a secure line to confirm the trap was fully primed. The Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had gone through our audit dossier with meticulous care. They had traced every forged invoice and every offshore shell company directly back to Derek. Warren assured me that federal agents were already in position in the service corridors, completely invisible to the wealthy guests inside. There was no room left for mercy at all. I had spent that final hour in my bedroom, carefully pressing the bespoke charcoal gray suit I had kept sealed in a cedar closet for 10 years. It was the armor of the founder, a garment commissioned for the night I had originally retired. When I drew the heavy wool jacket over my shoulders, the humble, invisible old man was gone. I picked up the dark leather folder, holding the absolute proof of Derek's theft and Clifford's complicity. The collision course was irrevocably set. Now, I stood in the shadowed alcove of the mezzanine balcony, completely out of sight, watching the floor below with the cold precision of a predator studying its prey. Derek was planted at the exact center of the room, holding a crystal flute of champagne, as though it were a royal scepter. A tight circle of senior board members and wealthy investors surrounded him. He threw his head back and laughed at something, his teeth catching the light. His tailored tuxedo fit him perfectly, projecting an aura of untouchable power. He looked like a man who had conquered everything. He was playing the role of the visionary chief executive, completely blind to the fact that his corporate credit cards had been frozen and his executive authority stripped away by my hand more than 24 hours ago. He was a ghost, haunting his own celebration, performing like an invincible king while standing on a trapdoor. A few yards away, Derek's parents were staging their own sickening display. Clifford and Loretta glided through the crowd of dignitaries like royalty reviewing their subjects. Clifford was aggressively gripping the shoulder of a prominent city alderman, leaning in close to deliver some fabricated tale of his financial acumen. On his wrist sat a diamond-studded watch I knew for a fact had been purchased with funds diverted from our logistics payroll. Loretta was worse. She paraded a heavy diamond necklace that caught the light, with every step her silk gown trailing behind her. She was introducing herself to the wives of our largest shareholders, as though she were the matriarch of a long-established dynasty. They were flaunting stolen wealth, drunk on the attention of people who wouldn't spare them a glance if they knew the truth. Their own arrogance insulated them completely. They didn't notice the broad-shouldered men standing near the service exits with earpieces. They didn't see the federal agents waiting in the shadows. I drew out the gold pocket watch Elaine had given me on our 20th anniversary and checked the time. The hour for observation had passed. The mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting I had quietly forced the legal department to schedule was set to begin in exactly 3 minutes. I turned from the balcony and walked down the sweeping carpeted staircase toward the main foyer. With every step, the burden of the past week fell away from my shoulders. The crisp, heavy wool of the charcoal gray suit pulled across my frame, demanding respect and projecting uncompromising authority. The transformation was striking. I was no longer the pathetic, uneducated father-in-law they had ridiculed in the hardware store. I was the architect. I was the absolute majority shareholder of Crestline Logistics, and I was here to reclaim what was mine. I reached the base of the staircase and stepped onto the marble floor of the grand foyer. 2 massive walnut doors stood between me and the ballroom. I didn't pause. I didn't wait for an invitation. I set both hands against the polished wood and drove the heavy doors open with a forceful, echoing crack. The impact as the doors hit the walls cut straight through the ambient noise of the gala. The jazz trio lost the thread for a moment, the melody faltering as the musicians turned toward the entrance. A wave of silence swept the room, starting at the back and rolling steadily toward the center. Hundreds of heads turned to see who had dared to disrupt the carefully maintained flow of the evening. I stepped into the brilliant light of the ballroom. I did not move with the slow, uncertain gait of a retired old man. I crossed the floor in long, deliberate strides, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes fixed dead ahead. The charcoal gray suit absorbed the light, making me appear like a dark, immovable pillar set against a sea of vivid color. The younger executives and the politicians simply looked baffled, unsure who this imposing figure was. But the older board members, the men and women who had been with Crestline Logistics from the earliest days, recognized me on the spot. I watched the color drain from the face of our chief financial officer. I saw the lead legal counsel lurch backward, his champagne glass slipping from his hand and dropping onto the thick carpet. The whispers ignited and spread like wildfire. The board members were terrified. The ghost had returned. The wave of stunned silence reached the center of the room. Derek stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned, an irritated scowl already forming, clearly annoyed that his audience had looked away. His eyes found me moving steadily across the ballroom floor. For a fraction of a second, his mind completely failed to process what it was seeing. He recognized the face of the man he had berated in a small kitchen, but the posture, the clothing, and the suffocating aura of authority did not match the reality he'd constructed. Clifford and Loretta halted their parade. Loretta's hand flew to her stolen diamond necklace, her jaw falling open in pure disbelief. Clifford's smug smile collapsed, replaced by a look of deep, paralyzing confusion. They had explicitly forbidden me from setting foot in this building. They had threatened to have security drag me out to the curb. And yet, here I was, moving through the very heart of their kingdom, radiating total authority, and not a single guard dared step into my path. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes fixed on Derek, moving directly toward the main stage with the heavy leather folder that held the end of his life. The music in the grand ballroom seemed to dissolve into a dull, vibrating hum as I crossed the polished marble floor. The vast crowd of politicians, bank executives, and corporate leaders peeled apart before me, instinctively feeling the sudden heavy shift in the atmosphere. They had no idea who I was, but they recognized the absolute authority radiating from the charcoal gray suit. Clifford and Loretta were stationed near a towering, glittering ice sculpture, holding crystal flutes of imported champagne. Loretta spotted me first. I watched the color drain completely from her heavily powdered face. Her hand trembled so violently that she spilled a splash of golden liquid down the front of her expensive silk gown. She seized Clifford by the arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging hard into the fabric of his sleeve. Clifford turned, following the line of her terrified gaze. His initial expression of mild, wealthy annoyance instantly twisted into a mask of furious, unvarnished rage. They abandoned their conversation with a prominent local politician on the spot and bore down on me. They moved with the frantic, aggressive energy of people terrified that their carefully constructed illusion was about to be torn apart. Clifford blocked my path, planting himself so close I could catch the sharp bite of alcohol on his breath. He looked me up and down, his eyes practically bulging with hatred. He didn't register the immaculate tailoring or the quality of the bespoke Scottish wool. He saw only the man he had mocked so savagely in the hardware store, the man he was certain belonged in the dirt. He dropped his voice to a vicious hiss, demanding to know how a pathetic beggar had slipped through the front doors. He accused me of sneaking in through the service entrance like a rat hunting for scraps. Loretta moved up right beside him, her face burning red with venom. She hissed that I was a disgusting embarrassment to her family and to polite society. She told me I was deliberately trying to ruin the most important night of her son's life. She ordered me to turn around, walk out, and crawl back to my miserable suburban house before she had me removed by force. I didn't blink. I didn't give them a single word in reply. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly against the dark leather folder at my side. I looked straight through them, extending precisely the level of insignificance they had actually earned. The commotion hadn't gone unnoticed. Across the ballroom, Derek stood frozen near the main stage. He was surrounded by the full executive board of directors, the exact people he needed to impress to lock down his corporate takeover. I watched him register the disturbance. I watched his eyes find my face. The blinding panic that swept over his features was a magnificent sight. His polished, practiced smile came apart completely. He excused himself quickly from the cluster of senior executives, his neck flushing a deep, angry crimson. He marched across the ballroom floor, his polished leather shoes hammering the marble with heavy, aggressive strikes. He was sweating visibly under the chandelier lights. The confident, untouchable king of Crestline logistics was suddenly frightened of a single old man standing quietly in his ballroom. Derek shouldered past a group of startled investors and wedged himself directly between Clifford and me. He dropped his voice to a trembling, vicious growl. He asked me if I had completely lost my mind. He shoved in my face the legal documents I had signed in my living room barely 24 hours ago. He told me I had permanently surrendered every right I had to his family, to his company. He demanded to know why I was deliberately humiliating him in front of the wealthy elite who controlled his future. He threatened to obliterate my relationship with Nadia. He promised to ensure I died utterly alone, cut off from my only daughter and any future grandchildren. He was practically vibrating with rage, projecting every ounce of his guilt, fear, and arrogance directly at me. He genuinely believed he still held absolute power. He was convinced he could bully me back into silent submission, the same way he always had. I let his threats hang in the cold, tense air between us. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or match his frantic sweating energy. I simply stood there, a solid, immovable wall of charcoal gray wool, holding the physical proof of his impending federal indictment in my hands. I watched the heavy beads of sweat forming across his forehead. I watched the trembling of his hand as he jabbed a finger at my chest. He was coming apart right in front of me. He couldn't grasp why his threats weren't landing. He couldn't understand why the uneducated father-in-law refused to cower. My complete silence maddened him more than any shouted insult could have. It drove him to the very edge of reason. Derek recognized that verbal intimidation was failing. His eyes swept frantically around the room, hunting for a way to claw back control of his narrative. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers hard in the air, signaling across the ballroom. He locked eyes with the head of corporate security, a massive, broad-shouldered man, positioned near the main entrance. Derek aimed a finger directly at me. He ordered the security chief to physically remove me from the premises immediately. He had stopped caring about keeping his voice low. He wanted the surrounding guests to hear him assert his dominance. He announced to the room that I was a deranged trespasser who had harassed his family for months. He told the security team to drag me outside, drop me on the pavement, and contact the city police. He declared he was pressing full criminal charges for trespassing and harassment. He wanted to make a brutal public spectacle of my removal. He wanted the entire board of directors to watch him decisively eliminate a threat. Clifford and Loretta smirked, crossing their arms in shared malicious satisfaction. They were eager to see me humiliated and hauled out of the luxury hotel. The head of security began to move. He was a seasoned professional, a man I had personally approved for hire over a decade ago to protect the Crestline Logistics corporate headquarters. He came across the floor with his face set in an unreadable mask of duty. 2 additional guards flanked him, moving in tight formation to execute the removal. The wealthy crowd drew back on both sides, clearing a path to avoid the confrontation. Derek sneered at me, whispering that my pathetic little rebellion was officially finished. He told me I was about to spend the rest of the night in a concrete holding cell. I kept my breathing slow and steady. I didn't move a single step backward. Both hands stayed firmly on the dark leather folder. The head of security reached our group. He raised his heavy hand, preparing to close it on my shoulder and drive me toward the exit. Derek stepped back with an air of pride, giving the guards room to do his dirty work. But that heavy hand never touched my suit. Before the security chief could make contact, a tall, immaculate figure stepped smoothly out of the shadows near a mezzanine pillar. It was Warren, my corporate attorney, moved with the silent, predatory confidence of a man who owned every inch of the battlefield. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He simply walked into the center of the confrontation and took his place directly beside me. The head of security stopped dead. His heavy hand froze in midair. The veteran guard recognized Warren immediately. Every senior employee in the Crestline Logistics Security Division knew that Warren was the sole representative on Earth of the anonymous founder's blind trust. Warren was the highest legal authority in the entire corporate structure, completely superseding the chief executive officer. The security chief looked at Warren, then looked at me, standing calmly at his side in the bespoke suit, the executive portfolio in my hands. The realization struck the man like a physical blow. He understood instantly the catastrophic magnitude of what he was looking at. He recognized the true chain of command. The massive man dropped his hand immediately. He took a deliberate step back, squared his broad shoulders, and bowed his head respectfully toward me. He didn't look at Derek. He didn't acknowledge Clifford or Loretta. The absolute authority in that room had just shifted violently, and Derek was left standing fully exposed in the ruins of his own shattered reality. Warren didn't wait for the security chief to finish retreating. He turned his back on the trembling guards and walked with purpose toward the grand stage at the far end of the ballroom. His footsteps were soundless on the thick carpet, but the crowd parted for him all the same. People recognized the chief legal counsel of the Blind Trust. They understood that his presence meant corporate business of the very highest order. The jazz trio was still working through a gentle standard in the corner of the ballroom, entirely unaware of the seismic event that had just unfolded on the floor below them. Warren climbed the 3 short steps to the stage and approached the sleek silver microphone at its center. He reached out and tapped the metal mesh twice with one finger. The sharp, amplified knock cracked through the cavernous room like a pistol shot. The musicians lurched in their seats. The cellist dragged his bow violently across the strings, sending a discordant shriek into the air before the music died altogether. The silence that followed was total and suffocating. Hundreds of conversations stopped in the same instant. The crystal clinking and the low hum of high society small talk gave way to a thick, hanging anticipation. Every eye in the luxurious ballroom locked onto Warren. He adjusted the microphone and surveyed the assembled crowd, wealthy investors, politicians, corporate executives. He did not smile. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone, carrying the unmistakable weight of federal authority. He formally called an emergency mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting to order. A wave of confusion moved through the crowd. Gala dinners were for champagne toasts and celebrating mergers, not for invoking emergency corporate bylaws. A handful of board members began trading uneasy glances. They recognized the legal language Warren was deploying. They understood that a mandatory shareholder meeting could only be called under conditions of severe financial peril or executive misconduct. Warren pressed on without a moment's hesitation. He stated that under the specific provisions of the corporate charter, the absolute majority shareholder held the unilateral right to freeze all executive actions and address the board at any time. He announced that for the first time in a decade, the anonymous founder of Crestline Logistics had chosen to step out of the shadows. That founder had watched the internal rot spreading through his company and had come to personally set things right. The founder was standing in this very room. Derek let out a loud theatrical scoff that carried cleanly across the hushed space. He straightened his expensive silk tie and squared his shoulders. He was completely blind to the reality closing in around him. He genuinely took this for a dramatic corporate flourish. He figured this was a surprise introduction, staged by the elusive billionaire, a public blessing of the upcoming merger, a validation of his own leadership from on high. Derek scanned the room eagerly, his eyes moving across the crowd of older men in custom tuxedos, searching for a face he could charm. He readied his most winning smile. He thought he was moments away from shaking hands with a legendary business titan and welcoming him to the stage as a peer. He assumed the founder would clap him on the back and sing his praises in front of the entire city. He was already composing the press release in his head. His vanity blinded him entirely to the cold truth, standing just a few yards away. Warren did not scan the room. He kept his eyes perfectly level. He raised his right hand and pointed one steady finger directly at me. The crowd turned as one following the invisible line from the stage to where I stood in my charcoal gray suit, tailored from the finest Scottish wool. The weight of 1,000 eyes landed on me all at once. I did not hurry. I tightened my grip on the heavy leather folder holding the forensic audit. I started toward the stage. The crowd opened before me, giving me a wide berth, the way water parts around something solid and immovable. Every step was measured, deliberate. I was no longer the man hauling 40 OLB bags of garden mulch at the hardware store. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable father-in-law they had felt safe dismissing and mistreating. I was the architect of the very ground they were standing on. I walked past the ashen faces of the senior vice presidents who already understood that the balance of power had shifted. I walked past the federal agents posted near the exits, knowing they were there for one reason, waiting for the words from my mouth that would authorize their arrest warrants. I reached the wooden steps leading up to the platform and began to climb. The solid thud of my black derby shoes against the wood rang out through the silent room. I stepped onto the stage and took my place beside Warren. I looked down at the crowd. Derek stood in the front row less than 10 feet away. The arrogant smile had vanished completely from his face. The healthy color drained from his skin in an instant, leaving him the shade of dirty ash. His mouth fell slightly open, but nothing came out. He stared up at me, eyes wide, with a raw, unadulterated terror he couldn't hide. His mind was violently rejecting what it was seeing. The man who held absolute power over his entire existence was the same man he had mocked, robbed, and tried to throw out into the street just moments ago. In that agonizing second, he understood that his career, his wealth, and his freedom were entirely in my hands. He looked at the thick leather folder under my arm and knew that his perfect crime had been laid bare. A few feet from Derek, Clifford, and Loretta stood frozen in absolute shock. Loretta was rigid as stone. Her hand still clutched her stolen diamond necklace, knuckles gone bone white. She took in my bespoke suit and the undeniable authority I occupied on that stage. The awful realization that she had spent 30 minutes publicly insulting the billionaire founder of the company broke over her like a physical blow. Clifford looked as though he might be violently ill. He swayed slightly on his expensive Italian loafers. The smug, predatory sneer he had worn all evening had been replaced by the wide, trapped stare of a cornered animal. They had spent years erecting a false dynasty on the foundation of my quiet labor. They had convinced themselves I was weak because I was kind. They had mistaken my preference for a simple private life as an absence of intelligence or ambition. Now, the entire foundation of their stolen empire was crumbling beneath their feet. The millions they had siphoned, the luxury cars, the exotic vacations they had flaunted, all of it was about to be cataloged as federal evidence. The silence stretched across the ballroom, taut and heavy with the weight of what was coming. I stood at the center of the stage, looking out over the empire I had built from nothing. I stepped up to the microphone, opened the leather folder, and prepared to dismantle their world piece by piece. I looked out over that sea of terrified faces from the polished acrylic podium. The silence in the grand ballroom was so complete, I could hear the faint electric hum of the stage lights overhead. I did not raise my voice. There was no need. True power doesn't demand volume. It demands absolute, unshakable certainty. I leaned into the silver microphone and let my voice fill the cavernous room with a quiet, terrifying precision. I welcomed the board of directors, the shareholders, and the distinguished guests to this mandatory emergency disclosure meeting. I told them that for the past decade I had entrusted the daily operations of Crestline Logistics to a new generation of leadership. I had believed in their vision and in their integrity, but trust without verification is nothing more than foolishness. And my verification had uncovered a staggering depth of betrayal. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, brief nod to the audio-visual technicians in the glass booth at the back of the room. Warren had secured their full cooperation hours earlier. The massive high-definition screens behind me had been showing the glowing logo of the proposed corporate merger. In an instant, those screens went black. Then they lit up with something far more revealing. Enormous blown-up images of offshore bank statements, corporate ledgers, and shell company registries flooded every screen in the room. The harsh white glare of the financial documents washed over the stunned faces of the elite crowd. I began to speak methodically, walking the board of directors through every step of the fraud. I laid out the fictitious vendors Derek had constructed to funnel cash out of our hardware division. I showed the audience exactly how he had manipulated the quarterly earnings reports to mask the financial bleeding. I pointed to specific wire transfer logs identifying the precise dates and exact amounts diverted into untraceable accounts. The audience stared at the screens in absolute horror. These were bankers, politicians, seasoned investors. They knew precisely what they were seeing. They were looking at a textbook embezzlement scheme orchestrated from the highest level of leadership. I did not let them look away. I traced the path of the stolen money for the room, from the corporate treasury through a maze of shell companies, and finally into the personal accounts of the man standing in the front row. I watched the senior vice presidents physically edge away from Derek as though his corruption might be catching. The murmurs of disbelief grew louder, with each new piece of evidence rippling outward through the crowd. The assembled elite were beginning to understand that the man they had been toasting all evening was nothing more than a highly polished parasite. But I wasn't finished. The corporate theft was only one dimension of this reckoning. The personal arrogance of his family demanded its own specific dismantling. I pressed a button on the podium, and the massive screens shifted again. A detailed official ownership deed for an 80FT luxury yacht filled the displays. The purchase price was circled in bright red ink. Beside it sat the corresponding wire transfer from a Crestline Logistics account, matching the exact dollar amount down to the last cent. I looked directly at Clifford and Loretta, both of them frozen in the middle of the crowd. I spoke clearly and deliberately into the microphone. I informed the entire ballroom that the glamorous lifestyle of the chief executive officer's family was a pathetic illusion, funded entirely by stolen corporate capital. The clothes on their backs, the designer jewelry they were wearing, and the champagne in their glasses had all been purchased with money taken from my company. Clifford went the color of chalk. He retreated into the crowd, desperately trying to disappear from the glare of the screens. Loretta let out a strangled gasp, both trembling hands flying to her mouth. Her diamond necklace suddenly looked less like an ornament and more like a shackle. The crowd around them pulled back immediately, leaving Clifford and Loretta standing alone inside a wide ring of pure social exile. The high society guests who had been sipping their expensive champagne now stared at their glasses as if the liquid had gone sour. The politicians and socialites who had been lavishing them with praise barely 10 minutes earlier now regarded them with naked contempt. I had exposed their counterfeit wealth and their manufactured aristocracy to the very audience they had most desperately wanted to impress. They were not titans of industry. They were common thieves playing dress-up with my money. The collective gasp from the crowd was a beautiful symphony of collapsing reputations. Derek could no longer bear the total destruction of his world. Something in him broke under the crushing weight of public humiliation. He let out a ragged, desperate shout and threw himself toward the wooden steps of the stage. He scrambled up the stairs, his perfectly tailored tuxedo pulling awkwardly across his sweating frame. His face was a mask of pure panic. He reached out with shaking hands, trying to physically wrench the microphone away from me. He stammered wildly, shouting that the documents were fabricated, that this was an elaborate conspiracy to frame him. He begged the board of directors to ignore every word coming out of my mouth. He sounded like a frightened child, caught dead in a lie. He was completely pathetic, shredding the last remnants of his carefully constructed executive persona in front of everyone who had ever mattered to him. Warren moved swiftly to intercept him, but I raised my hand and waved off my attorney. A broken man posed no threat to me. I held my position immovable and composed as Derek clawed at the air between us. He was weeping now, tears of terror and frustration unraveling his perfect image in real time. He rambled that he could make it right, that he could return every dollar, that he only needed one chance to walk them through the complicated financial arrangements. His frantic, breathless excuses echoed through the microphone, amplifying every ounce of his desperation out to the entire room. He promised to resign quietly if I would just kill the screens and let him leave. I looked him straight in the eye. All the noise fell away until there was nothing but the space between us. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I leaned into the microphone, making certain my voice would reach the very back of the hall and beyond. I told him his explanations were worthless and his promises meant nothing. I told him his reign as master of the universe was permanently finished. Then, in a voice as cold and hard as steel, I delivered the final absolute verdict. I told Derek that effective immediately he was terminated from Crestline Logistics. I stripped him of his title, his authority, and his access. I told him he was nothing but a petty thief in a borrowed suit, and he would never again set foot in my building. The words settled over the room like a judgment carved in stone. The public execution was complete. Derek dropped to his knees right there on the stage, sobbing into his hands as the full reality of his ruin finally crushed him. He was a crumpled heap of tailored wool and shattered ego on the polished floorboards. The echo of his termination still hung in the dead silence of the grand ballroom. The crowd of politicians and corporate titans stood completely paralyzed, holding their breath and waiting to see what came next. I looked down at the man who had tried to steal my life and destroy my daughter. He was quietly sobbing into his palms. Every trace of his false bravado had been stripped away, but firing him was merely an administrative correction, a corporate formality. The true punishment for his betrayal had to reach far beyond the walls of Crestline Logistics. I drew my eyes slowly away from Derek and looked toward the back of the room. I raised my right hand into the air. It was a simple, silent gesture, the signal Warren and I had planned meticulously hours before. The heavy walnut doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst inward with a force that sent them slamming against the walls. Several wealthy guests jumped at the impact. A team of 12 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division filed into the room. They wore dark tactical suits and heavy vests stamped with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their arrival shattered what remained of the evening's illusion of high society elegance. They moved with complete military precision. Their heavy black boots struck the marble floors in a steady, terrifying rhythm. The wealthy guests parted instantly before them. Men in custom tuxedos and women in designer gowns pressed themselves out of the way, practically climbing over each other. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near the blast radius of a federal raid. The lead agent walked straight toward the main stage without a glance to either side. He mounted the wooden steps with heavy, purposeful strides. 2 agents flanked him, covering his blind spots. Derek lifted his tear-streaked face just in time to see the federal authorities closing in around him. He scrambled backward like a cornered rat. He babbled incoherent pleas, promising the agents he could explain everything to a judge if they would just wait. The lead agent paid no attention to his whimpering. He seized Derek by the shoulder of his expensive tuxedo jacket and pulled him to his feet. The agent wrenched Derek's arms behind his back. The sharp metallic snap of the steel handcuffs closing around his wrists rang out clearly through the microphone I was still standing beside. It was the sweetest sound I had heard in 10 years. Derek let out a high-pitched wail as the cold metal bit into his skin. The untouchable corporate king was reduced in an instant to a weeping federal prisoner. Down on the ballroom floor, the reality of what was happening finally registered in Clifford's arrogant mind. He watched his son placed in handcuffs. He saw the federal raid unfolding in full. The cowardly reflex that had defined his entire miserable existence took over completely. He made no move to help his son. He didn't even glance at his wife. Clifford simply turned on his pristine white loafers and ran. He shoved a prominent city alderman aside and sprinted desperately toward the side exit near the catering kitchen. He looked absolutely ridiculous in his cashmere sweater legs churning in full flight. He believed he could slip out into the night and outrun the catastrophic consequences of his own greed. But Warren had accounted for every variable. 2 federal agents had been stationed silently at that exact exit for more than an hour. As Clifford threw his weight against the brass handle, they stepped out of the shadows and intercepted him with brutal efficiency. One agent grabbed Clifford by the cashmere sweater and drove him firmly into the patterned wallpaper. Clifford cried out in pain and panic as his arms were wrenched behind him and locked in heavy iron cuffs. Loretta stood completely motionless near the towering ice sculpture, watching her husband pinned to the wall and her son held captive on the stage. Her thickly powdered face was frozen in a mask of pure horror. A female federal agent approached her with a stern, unyielding look. The agent produced a thick stack of legal warrants from inside her jacket. She announced loudly that Clifford and Loretta were officially under investigation for federal racketeering and receipt of stolen corporate funds. She informed the entire silent ballroom that every one of their bank accounts had been fully frozen. She declared that their luxury vehicles' offshore accounts and the ADFE yacht docked in Miami were being seized immediately by the federal government. The agent fixed her gaze on Loretta and demanded the surrender of the diamond necklace around her neck. She stated it had been purchased with embezzled funds and was classified as active federal evidence. Loretta let out a raw, guttural scream. It was the sound of a woman watching everything she had invented for herself burn to nothing. Her knees buckled beneath her silk trench coat, and she collapsed onto the polished floor in hysterics. The female agent showed not a trace of sympathy. She bent down and deftly unclasped the heavy diamond necklace from Loretta's neck. She dropped the glittering stones into a clear plastic evidence bag with a flat, dismissive sound. Loretta knelt on the floor, sobbing and gasping, reaching out with shaking hands toward the wealthy guests she had spent all evening trying to impress. She begged them for help. She pleaded for someone to call a lawyer. The elite crowd stared back at her with cold, undisguised contempt. The very society she had craved so desperately was now regarding her like something to be avoided. The lead agent on the stage gave a sharp nod to his team. The authorities moved Derek Clifford and Loretta toward the main entrance. It was a procession of absolute total disgrace. Derek stumbled down the stage steps with his head bowed low, trying to hide his weeping face from the board members who had just witnessed his complete destruction. Clifford was hauled by the collar of his ruined cashmere sweater, his pristine loafers dragging against the carpet. He was blubbering incoherently, doing his best to shield his face from the crowd's relentless stare. Loretta was brought to her feet and marched alongside them, her mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. The entire grand ballroom watched in total silence as the counterfeit aristocratic family was walked out into the cold night. They left that luxurious hotel in steel handcuffs, stripped of their stolen wealth and their manufactured dignity. I stood tall at the podium and watched the heavy walnut doors swing shut behind them. The corporate cancer had been cut out entirely. The air in the ballroom felt clean for the first time all evening. The federal agents had carried out their duties with flawless precision, leaving no room for ambiguity or doubt. The long, brutal war was over. I looked out over the silent gathering of executives and investors. They stared back at me with a mixture of genuine awe and unmistakable unease. They now understood the true cost of betraying the foundation of this company. I straightened my charcoal gray suit, tailored from the finest Scottish wool, and prepared to address my board of directors. The true founder of Crestline Logistics had fully reclaimed his stolen empire, and a new era built on absolute integrity was about to begin. The grand ballroom began to empty, leaving behind a deep and heavy silence. The shaken corporate elite and their socialite companions fled through the gilded exit doors, desperate to put distance between themselves and the federal raid they had just witnessed. The jazz trio had packed up their instruments and slipped quietly into the night. The catering staff moved like shadows, collecting half-empty champagne flutes and untouched silver platters of caviar. The opulent space that had felt just an hour ago like an impenetrable fortress of arrogance now resembled an abandoned theater after the final curtain had fallen. I stood near the edge of the main stage and drew a slow, deep breath. The charcoal gray wool of my bespoke suit felt considerably lighter across my shoulders. The corporate execution was complete, and the federal authorities were processing their prisoners. But the most important task of my evening was still ahead of me. I turned away from the empty podium and let my eyes move across the expanse of polished marble. I found her standing near the large walnut doors at the very back of the room. Nadia looked remarkably small in that cavernous space. She wore a simple dark dress that stood in sharp contrast to the extravagant gowns that had been on display all evening. She was gripping the edge of a velvet-draped cocktail table, her knuckles white. Even at a distance, I could see the trembling in her shoulders. She had watched the entire spectacle from the shadows. She had witnessed the demolition of her husband's false empire and the shocking truth of her father's real identity. The foundation of everything she understood about her life had been shattered and rearranged in the space of 30 minutes. I stepped down from the stage and crossed the ballroom floor. My leather shoes made a soft, steady rhythm against the marble as I moved toward my only daughter. As I drew near, Nadia slowly raised her head. Her eyes were wide and filled with a churning mix of shock, confusion, and something that looked like overwhelming awe. She took in my tailored suit and the quiet authority I now carried without apology. Her whole life, she had known me as a modest, unpretentious man who worked with his hands and preferred cedar sawdust to expensive cologne. She had watched me absorb the relentless condescension of her husband and his arrogant family without ever raising my voice. Now, she was looking at the absolute majority shareholder of a multinational corporation, the man who had just brought a fraudulent dynasty to its knees with a single command. I stopped a few feet from her. I didn't speak right away. I simply opened my arms. Nadia let out a soft, breathless sound and closed the distance between us. She fell against my chest, pressing her face into the dark wool of my jacket. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her into a fierce, protective hold. I held her with the same desperate strength I used when she was a small girl, waking from a bad dream. I felt the shaking in her body slowly ease as she leaned into me. The cold, formal atmosphere of the hotel ballroom fell away, leaving only the unbreakable bond between a father and his child. Nadia clutched the lapels of my jacket, her tears soaking into the fabric. She pulled back slightly and looked up at me. She told me she finally understood everything. She whispered that the missing pieces had suddenly, violently locked into place. She recognized the full depth of the deception Derek had constructed around her. She understood that his sudden romantic interest, his rushed marriage proposal, and his persistent efforts to isolate her had all been calculated steps in a predatory financial scheme. He had never loved her. He had only loved what she represented: proximity to power and access to a fortune he believed he could take for himself. Nadia voiced this devastating realization in a trembling voice, but her eyes were clear. The poisonous illusion of her marriage was broken beyond repair. I kept my hands resting gently on her shoulders, holding her steady. I knew I owed her a real accounting for the secret I had carried for so long. I spoke in a quiet, measured voice, making sure every word carried the full weight of my love. I told her that building a large corporate empire brings a very particular and dangerous kind of visibility. It draws in parasites and opportunists who assign human value entirely in terms of bank balances and stock portfolios. When her mother passed and I was left to raise her on my own, I made a solemn promise to protect her from that toxic artificial world. I explained that I concealed the wealth and stepped back from any public executive role because I wanted her to grow up rooted in something real. I wanted her to value hard work, honesty, and genuine human connection. And above all, I wanted her to be loved for the brilliant and beautiful person she was, not for the size of a hidden trust fund. She needed to find her way in the world without the corrupting weight of a vast inheritance distorting every relationship she formed. I told Nadia that true wealth is invisible. It isn't found in diamond necklaces, luxury yachts, or imported champagne. It lives in character and integrity. I wanted her to build a life on those principles. but in my fierce determination to shield her from the darkness of the corporate world, I had left a blind spot I hadn't seen coming. I bowed my head and offered my daughter a sincere and heavy apology. I apologized for allowing a parasite like Derek to work his way into our lives and exploit her trust. I told her how profoundly sorry I was for the pain he had inflicted, for the tears she had shed at our kitchen table just a few nights before. I had been so consumed with maintaining the appearance of a simple life that I let a predator walk through our door. I promised her it was my gravest failure as a father, one I would never repeat. I wiped a stray tear from her cheek with my thumb. I looked into her eyes and made her an absolute promise. I told her she was completely and permanently free. The legal trap had been sprung, and the federal authorities had neutralized the threat. Derek and his corrupt family would spend the rest of their miserable lives absorbing the catastrophic consequences of their own limitless greed. They would never cast a shadow across her life again. She was safe, and her future was entirely her own to shape. Nadia looked at me, and something profound moved across her face. The lingering fear and betrayal that had lived behind her eyes for months simply dissolved. She let out a long, shaking breath and began to cry again. But these were not tears of sadness or grief. They were tears of total overwhelming relief and deep gratitude. The heavy, suffocating weight of a fraudulent marriage had been lifted. She pressed her head against my chest once more and held on tight. We stood together in the quiet emptiness of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the fading echoes of a demolished empire. The storm had finally broken, and the air was clean. I held my daughter close, knowing we had endured the very worst they could throw at us and come through it completely intact. 6 months were all it took to dissolve the illusion of their empire entirely. Federal justice moves with a slow, grinding certainty that leaves no room for arrogance to survive. Derek never faced a drawn-out courtroom drama. His expensive defense attorneys took one look at the mountain of forensic evidence Warren had assembled and advised him to surrender without contest. Derek accepted a federal plea agreement covering wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate racketeering. The judge extended no leniency toward a man who had weaponized corporate trust to steal millions. He was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The leap from penthouse to concrete cell broke him completely. He exchanged his bespoke suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The man who once commanded boardrooms with a snap of his fingers now had to request permission to use the telephone. His days are governed by the harsh buzz of prison alarms and the heavy slam of iron doors. He sleeps on a thin mattress in a narrow cell, surrounded by noise and absolute isolation. Every waking hour is spent understanding that his bottomless greed was the precise architect of his own permanent cage. Derek's conviction was the hammer blow that shattered Clifford and Loretta's fragile aristocratic facade. The federal authorities didn't stop at putting Derek behind bars. They followed the money trail straight to his parents. The ADFT luxury yacht docked in Miami was seized by federal marshals and auctioned off to compensate the blind trust. The fleet of imported luxury cars was towed from their expansive driveway in the middle of the night. The accounts they had used to bankroll their extravagant lifestyle were frozen solid and drained by the government. The millions they believed were rightfully theirs evaporated without a trace, leaving them with absolutely nothing. Federal racketeering statutes allowed the government to confiscate every asset tied to the embezzled funds. Clifford and Loretta stood in helpless terror as federal agents boxed up their expensive artwork, their designer clothing, and their stolen jewelry. The empire they had believed was secured through their son's scheming dissolved, leaving them fully exposed to a reality their arrogance had never prepared them for. Losing the stolen wealth was devastating, but for Loretta, the social execution cut deeper. Elite circles operate by a ruthless set of unwritten rules. The moment news of Derek's federal indictment broke in the morning, papers Clifford and Loretta were instantly and permanently cast out. The country club memberships they had flaunted were revoked without ceremony. The gala invitations and exclusive dinner cards stopped arriving entirely. Loretta tried ringing her wealthy acquaintances, desperate for a sympathetic voice or a short-term loan. Every call rolled to voicemail. The women who once clinked glasses of expensive champagne with her now crossed the street rather than make eye contact. Clifford fared no better. The prominent businessmen and politicians he used to golf with suddenly had no memory of him. The aristocratic world they had spent years trying to penetrate expelled them the way a body rejects a foreign object. They had no real friends because their entire social architecture had been built on lies and borrowed money. Without the illusion of wealth, they were completely invisible. With their assets seized and their accounts emptied, Clifford and Loretta were forced out of their sprawling suburban home. They had no savings to fall back on, no marketable skills to draw income from. They were reduced to the very demographic they had spent their lives mocking and looking down upon. They landed in a cramped, unheated one-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city. The building was aging and deteriorating, flanked by cracked pavement and rusted chain-link fencing. There was no polished marble in the lobby, no valet attendants, no private security. The small kitchen had peeling linoleum floors and a refrigerator that rattled without stopping. Loretta could no longer spend her afternoons browsing high-end boutiques. She was reduced to clipping paper coupons and counting the cost of store-brand groceries. She had to learn the public bus routes because a vehicle was beyond their means. The designer silk dresses she had prized were replaced by cheap practical clothing, chosen for warmth in a drafty apartment. The contrast between what her life had been and what it now was amounted to a daily grinding punishment. Clifford struggled to process his new existence. He had spent his entire adult life performing the role of an industry titan without ever doing the actual work. Now, the unforgiving arithmetic of poverty demanded something he had never developed capability. Unpaid utility notices piled up on their small, scratched dining table. With Derek locked away in federal prison, there was no one left to steal on their behalf. Clifford was forced to swallow his enormous pride and look for work. At 60 years old, carrying a ruined reputation and no verifiable skills, his options were brutal and few. The man who used to sneer at service workers from the deck of a stolen yacht now had to submit applications for entry-level retail positions. Store managers glanced at his empty resume and moved on without a second thought. The irony was total and merciless. He passed his days sitting in the cold, drafty apartment, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. The relentless, gnawing dread of eviction had replaced the easy arrogance he once projected into every room he entered. He had built his entire sense of self around being superior to working people, and now he was drowning in the very hardships he used to ridicule. The physical discomfort of their diminished life was real, but the psychological torment was something else entirely. The tight walls of that cheap apartment forced Clifford and Loretta into each other's company every hour of every day. There was no sprawling estate to disappear into, no expensive wine to smooth the edges off the pain. The resentment building between them eventually boiled over into bitter, endless fighting. Clifford blamed Loretta for pushing Derek to steal more and more in order to satisfy her extravagant appetites. Loretta screamed at Clifford for being a weak, pathetic man who had never once provided for his family through honest means. They became vicious enemies trapped together in a cage of their own construction. The growing war between them consumed whatever remained of their marriage. There was nothing left to share but blame and contempt. Their son was gone. Their stolen wealth was gone. Their counterfeit friendships were gone. They were left entirely alone on the freezing outskirts of the city, with nothing to do but tear each other to pieces. They learned the hardest lesson of all in that tiny, unheated apartment. Real wealth is built on honest labor and genuine integrity. A palace constructed on lies and stolen money will always eventually come down. They had spent years looking down on quiet, decent men. They had treated kindness as a weakness to be exploited. They had convinced themselves that manipulation was a path to a permanent dynasty. The absolute ruin they now inhabited was the direct and inevitable result of their own unchecked greed. There was no path to redemption, no hidden account waiting in reserve to pull them back. The justice visited upon them was complete and final. The inescapable poverty they woke to every morning was a perfect reflection of the total emptiness at their core. They would live out the rest of their days paying the brutal grinding price for their supreme arrogance. The early morning air was crisp and absolutely still. I sat on the worn wooden steps of my front porch, cradling a chipped ceramic mug in both hands. The wood beneath me was old and weathered, marked by decades of shifting seasons, and the countless times my boots had scraped across its surface. I took a slow sip of the dark, bitter liquid, cheap store-bought coffee brewed strong, the way I had taken it for the past 40 years. I watched the first pale light of dawn spread across the horizon, washing the quiet suburban street in soft shades of blue and gray. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir. Across the street, Mrs. Gable was walking her golden retriever in a thick wool coat. The newspaper truck rolled around the corner, its tires humming softly over the damp asphalt. An entirely ordinary morning on an entirely ordinary street. Nobody looking at me on this peeling porch in my thick canvas shirt would ever guess at the scale of wealth I controlled. That was precisely how I intended to keep it. The screen door squeaked softly behind me. Nadia came out onto the porch, wrapped in an oversized knitted sweater and carrying her own steaming mug of coffee. She didn't say a word. She simply came down the steps and settled beside me, drawing her knees up to her chest. I looked at my daughter. The dark circles that had lived beneath her eyes for months were completely gone. The tightly wound tension that had gripped her shoulders throughout her miserable marriage to Derek had vanished entirely. She looked rested. She looked healthy. Most importantly, she looked completely at peace. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the cool morning air, watching the neighborhood ease into the day. There was no need to fill the quiet with empty words. The silence between us was no longer weighted with secrets or unspoken fears. It was a warm, easy silence resting on a foundation of absolute truth and rebuilt trust. Nadia leaned her head against my shoulder, and I pulled her close. Over the past 6 months, she had moved back into her childhood bedroom. We had spent countless hours at the old kitchen table, working through the pain and mending the bond that Derek had worked so hard to sever. She had asked me once, not long after the trial, why I had no interest in moving. She had seen the bank statements by then. She understood that I could acquire any sprawling estate in the most exclusive zip code on Earth. I could have purchased a fleet of luxury vehicles or a private jet. I told her the same thing I had been telling myself for years. A house is nothing but wood and glass, but a home is a living repository of human memory. I built this house with my own hands. I carried her mother over this very threshold. I marked Nadia's height on the kitchen door frame every single summer until she left for college. No amount of corporate capital can ever buy that kind of history. Moving into some sterile cavernous mansion would not improve my life. It would only erase the grounded reality I had spent decades building. The wealth I commanded was no longer a burden I kept hidden. It had returned to its proper function. It was simply a tool. Back inside the glass towers of Crestline Logistics, the corporate atmosphere had been transformed entirely. The toxic culture of greed and unchecked ambition that Derek had nurtured was fully eradicated. Warren and I had carefully assembled a new executive board from honest, pragmatic leaders who believed in sustainable growth and ethical practice. The company was thriving again. The profits were no longer being funneled through offshore shell companies to bankroll the lavish habits of parasites. The dividends were being reinvested in the employees and in the future. I had no need to occupy the corner office to know my empire was sound. Warren managed the day-to-day legal machinery of the blind trust with his characteristic precision. I remained the absolute majority shareholder, operating entirely from the shadows guiding the ship without ever needing to stand at the wheel. The billions held in those protected accounts were no longer a secret I had to guard with my life. They were a silent, impenetrable shield. I had put an ironclad legal structure in place to ensure Nadia would be protected for the rest of her life. The money would never define her. It would never again draw predators looking for an easy mark. It would simply sit quietly in the background, an invisible fortress against whatever hardships the world might send her way. She was working part-time at a local community center, finding real purpose in helping others. She was discovering who she was outside the shadow of a controlling husband and outside the blinding glare of high society. She was learning that genuine value comes from the work you do and the kindness you offer, not from the label on your coat. The sun finally cleared the horizon. Brilliant streaks of gold and orange spilled across the suburban lawns, igniting the dewdrops on the grass like thousands of tiny scattered diamonds. A light breeze moved through the leaves of the old oak tree in the front yard. I took another sip of my cheap bitter coffee and felt a deep, profound settling in my chest. The agonizing war was a distant memory. The violent storm that had threatened to pull my family apart had been decisively broken. The people who had tried to manipulate and destroy us were waking up this morning to the cold, metallic reality of their own inescapable consequences. They were rotting in prison cells and shivering in cramped apartments, paying the full price for their boundless arrogance. But here on this worn wooden porch, there was only safety. Order had been restored permanently. The dignity of my family remained completely intact. I looked out at the quiet street and then down at my daughter resting peacefully against my side. The greatest victory I understood was not the dismantling of my enemies or the reclaiming of a corporate empire. The greatest victory was simply this: sitting on a quiet morning, watching the sun rise with the person I loved most in the world. I had no need of a bespoke suit or a room full of terrified executives to prove my worth. The billionaire founder of Crestline Logistics was perfectly content in a thick canvas shirt, drinking coffee from a chipped mug. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the morning sun settle over my face. I knew then, with absolute and crystalline certainty, that true power never needs to raise its voice. True power simply exists, silent and unshakable, in the quiet peace of a life honestly lived. And that is where the road finally ended, not with a shout, but with a quiet morning on a worn porch, a cup of coffee, and a daughter who could breathe again. I think about what those years cost: the silence, the patience, watching people I loved get hurt while I held my position and trusted that the truth would eventually be enough. It nearly broke me more than once, but I believe God places the right tools in your hands at the right moment, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait until the hour is yours. The father stories that mean the most are rarely about grand gestures. They are about the long, quiet years of holding the line. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope you carry with you. Never confuse a man's silence for surrender. The quietest person in the room is often the one who has already won. If someone tries to buy your absence from the people you love, that is the clearest sign you should stay. Patience is not weakness. Build your case, document everything, and let the truth arrive on its own terms. Protect your children not just from hardship, but from the kind of people who would use their love against them. If these grandpa revenge stories have ever made you feel seen, like the slow and steady ones do finish first, then share this with someone who needs that reminder today. Leave a comment and tell me what part of Gerald's story hit you hardest. And if you haven't yet, come and join us here on Grandpa's Revenge, where every story is about the dignity that patience and honesty protect. Thank you for listening all the way through. It means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.